So villain has a think here. Obviously, we're hoping for a call, but instead we get the jam. And just look at how quickly I fold here. I'm not even interested in paying this bet off, because if someone is sick enough to bluff here when I can still have all the combos of straights as well, then good for them. I think the amount of the time I'm getting bluffed there is sub 10%, maybe even sub 5%, and I think calling would be a gigantic error that we always want to avoid. What's going on, guys? Pete Clark here, and in today's video I'm going to show you a morning session that I played at 200 Zoom. The hands come thick and fast, there's constant action, and I'm battling some really tough opponents all the way through this session. There are a few weaker players in the pool against whom I'm making some exploits, but for the most part I'm actually battling players who are choosing to grind the highest stake game available at that time of day. That's right, and it says a lot about the state of online poker, but the high stakes games just aren't running, and neither is 500 Zoom. Therefore, today's video is going to be highly instructional. I'm going to show you how to hold your own against really tough opposition from a theoretical baseline, but also do a touch of hand reading against some weaker opponents. Let's go, let's get into it, and I hope you learn a lot from this video. Please do smash the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I hope you enjoy. Alright, we're going to fly through some hands thick and fast today, guys. We get into a spot right away with fours here on the button, getting 3-bet by the big blind. Really standard defend and onto the flop where we flop bottom set. The Queen 8-4 board is actually one of the better boards for our range that's rainbow and dry. And this is because the Queen is the more favourable Broadway for button than the other ones. If you think about what combos like King Jack, Ace King, Jack 10 are doing pre-flop, they're generally folding or 4-betting in their offsuit variety, but there are a lot of offsuit combos of King Queen and Ace Queen that we actually get to defend here due to their decentness but not amazing hand strength. There are also 2 set making cards for a range on this board, so if you contrast Queen 8-4 to something like King 9 Deuce, well, the latter board there's only going to be 1 set making card at the 9 as we fold deuces pre and 4-bet kings, and also on that texture the king is going to be a much worse card for range than the queen. So not uncommon here for a tough morning pool and a decent regular to go ahead and check over some good hands here, protect that checking range, go for check raises like aces, kings, ace queen, king queen sets, and also go for some check calls and check folds with other parts of their range. Therefore, in this spot with fours, we're going to adopt one sizing with range, and that sizing is going to be small due to this overpaired disadvantage that our range is still going to suffer from. We make a small bet here, and villain goes into the tank. I think it's worth stressing that you want to simplify your sizing as much as possible. What you want to do is make sure that you're not overcomplicating your strategy with the inclusion of multiple bet sizes unnecessarily. There's plenty of time here to make up for lost ground later. A small bet will suffice. It allows us to value bet more thinly, and it already accounts for the fact that villain has more overpair. I like to think about my nut advantage when I'm picking a flop sizing, but also the SPR, as neither the SPR or the nut advantage is making me want to shovel tons of money into the pot, yet I'm just going to opt for the small bet here whenever I'm betting. I think another thing we can stress is that fours can actually check behind here, as weird as that would be in a single raise pot. Given that we only need 2 more bets to get all of the money in here, we can easily bet turn big over bet river with this hand if villain checks again, but more importantly there's just no rush at the stack to pot ratio, and so checking back a completely invincible hand or mostly invincible hand is gonna be fine. Sadly, villain folds. You can't always run into aces or kings when you've got a set. In this next one, we play the role of the big blind with king jack off. I think you can throw in a little bit of 3-bet here, but mostly it's going to be call. We get a flop of ace 8-3, and we face what we're typically going to face against this pool. A lot of people are going to simplify to betting range on this texture, and that's an okay thing to do. The fact that villain thinks for a bit here could indicate that they're splitting their range, or it could just indicate that they're doing something else. They're playing their Game Boy, or they're making a call on their cell phone. We opt to check call the flop this time, and the 10 of clubs turn comes down. I think it's worth saying that you don't really want to be folding right away here on the flop with a hand as good as backdoor and king high. This hand already has showdown value, and one of the hallmarks of this sort of combo on the flop is that it doesn't actually have to bluff later on many runouts. This is a great thing because it means that you can still showdown and win against weak hands in your opponent's range like worse king high, queen high, or any other give up, and it also means that you don't have to incur extra loss when your opponent has a better hand by bluffing like you would have to do with certain other combos. On this runout, of course, our hand shifts up more towards the value betting territory of our range, and we want to consider whether it's time to block bet here. The reason I focus on block here is I don't think the hand has enough equity to use a big bet. Essentially, the sizing you want to pick with a value combo on the river, and contrary to the last spot, I think it's okay to have multiple sizings in such a spot. This is going to be determined by your equity. if you land on the river with something like 70% equity, it's going to just be in block bet territory, whereas if that encroaches upon 75-80%, you can use a larger bet. If you get to the river with a hand that has 90% equity and you don't believe your opponent's going to raise your small bets often enough, you should definitely consider overbetting. Basically, the bigger you go in GTO, the more money you make if you're not getting raised. So we decide to block here. I think another really important reason to bet here theoretically instead of check. A lot of people make the mistake of checking this hand without thinking. Well, firstly, use your brain, switch on, do some thinking. Think about your side card here. What does the king do? The main role of the king is reducing your opponent's bluff combos. A very prevalent hand in your opponent's range here for bluffing river with a bet, check, bet line, that's scattered aggression, is going to be something like king 6 of hearts, king 7 of hearts, king 5, king 4, king deuce of hearts. Given we block so many combos of bluffs here, the idea of bluff catching with this side card doesn't make a lot of sense, but if we were on a drier run out where the king high was just checking back, then it could well be the case that we don't block bluffs anymore, and then checking could be a better idea. I think this hand just has to go for thin value. Villain has a think. Obviously we're expecting to be good when called here most of the time, but not all the time. Sometimes we're going to run into an ace or some river 2-pair reset or something like that. And this time villain does make the fold. Pocket 7's now on the button and we go for an open of 2.5 BBs and get 3-bet by small blind. The difference between this hand and hand number 1 today is that this player is going to have a more linear range, and that's just going to be something we should bear in mind post flop. The flop comes down 8, 10, deuce, all hearts, and villain quickly bets 1/3 pot. I think this could easily be encroaching upon a fold against anyone that's splitting range here and using a polarized strategy against people who are just betting range small on this texture, which probably isn't a horrible idea from small blind, where you're just going to have way more big hearts and big flushes than your opponent. I think it's okay just to peel here with a pair. This hand though is seriously degraded. It's much weaker than it would be on other textures, but here's how I decided that I had to call. When we faced 1/3 pot on a spot where we're in position, it's unusual that we're going to be overfolding compared to that MDF or break-even point fold equity that villain needs. In other words, we would have to defend 75% of our range to this 1/3 pot size c-bet here, and that means calling all pairs. The reason it has to mean calling all pairs is that way too much of our range is something like ace jack offsuit no heart, ace 9 suited with no heart, king jack, king queen suited with no heart. I think there's just too many hands like that in our range, as well as some lower pairs like 4s or 5s here that don't have a heart that would constitute easily the bottom quarter of our range. Therefore, I don't think we can actually fold 7s, especially if villain is just betting indiscriminately. It's not necessarily the case that they're doing this, but I think a lot of people do, and I think it's a widespread epidemic in poker right now that people simplify to betting range wherever they can get away with it. Therefore, we decide to call, but it's a reluctant and unhappy call, and we head on over to the turn of the 8 of clubs. This turn is going to favour our range a little bit, but it is a 3-bet pot where we don't have a ton of 8x combos. No one has a lot of snowmen here, and nobody has a lot of single 8x either. So this card is probably okay for villain, just in the sense that it makes their overpairs a bit more invincible against combos in our range like Jack 10 or Queen 10, King 10 that can no longer hit 2-pair and win. Because the dead man's hand's going to be out there, guys, right? The old aces and 8s, although I think that has to be black aces and black 8s for some reason. Okay, we decide to check back this time with pocket 7's no heart. I think this is reasonable. With a heart in my hand, I'd have a bit more equity against single heart hands because I'd be blocking some of their outs, and I'd also be able to hit a 7 on the river that would never be the 7 of hearts. Given that that would make a boat though now, that's not actually a reasonable point, but usually if this is an unpaired board, it is a relevant consideration whether or not that set making card is going to also bring a 4 flush or 3 flush. So we check back and the jack of clubs rolls off. We now squarely have a check down, a showdown value hand that's never going to be betting. It's just too far into the equity camp of between 30 and 60% equity. When you have a hand like that, you just don't bet because you just simply be losing extra money for no reason whatsoever, and it would be moronic and idiotic to bet. So we decide to check back if we face a check, but we face this half pot. And now we need to decide whether this is a bluff catcher with which we want to mix some call. What's going on here? Well, the jack is a pretty good card for villain's range. It's going to hit a lot of those big Broadway combos like king jack, ace jack, queen jack that went for 3 bets pre and decided to give up turn. There is still some air left in villain's range like ace, queen, and ace king, as well as some suited aces like ace 4 of spades if he's getting a bit out of line and betting everything on the flop. It's quite okay here that we have sevens. I don't think we're blocking any bluff combos on this node, so this seems like the sort of hand that could mix some bluff catch at some frequency. I also don't think we're blocking any value bets here, and I guess the value region is mainly going to be overpair and jack X here, so I think these blockers are fairly neutral. I would rather have a heart, obviously, because villain will never be bluffing with the 7 of hearts, but could have some ace-7 suited for a value bet there, or maybe even 6-7, depending how wide they are pre. So overall, I think this hand is like an average bluff catcher, and when I think about the rest of my range here, it's quite down there actually. I think I can just have like pocket pair plus heart, 10x that blocks more value hands, and all of these hands are probably going to be better to call with than 7s. I decide to fold here pure with this combo. I wouldn't be shocked if the solver mixed in some call here, but it couldn't be more than break even. In terms of whether this spot is being overbluffed or underbluffed, this is going to be determined by your opponent's ability to slow play good hands on the turn. If you think you're playing against somebody who believes that they can only bet the turn with a big heart, or believes that they are just always supposed to bet for protection, if you're against a weaker player that thinks like that, then they're not going to have enough value hands on this river, and you should probably just call here and expect this to be an overbluff situation. But in general, I don't think that a strong player at 200 zoom, it's just a tough opponent, is going to be falling into that trap necessarily, so I opt to play a bit more solidly here and just fold. King 3 of hearts in the big blind, and we call a cutoff open and check to the razor. I believe we face a bet on this flop, but no, we face a check here, right? I don't really remember. This was yesterday I played these hands. Yeah, we face a check. Now on the turn, I decided I would build two sizes here. This is a kind of standard spot where you can either have a block and an overbet, or you can just have a bigger bet. Maybe you can just have a block here as well. So this is quite a good run out for our range. Just 3 cards around the sort of low danger zone for our opponent here. The 9, 6, and 5, and even the deuce adds a little bit of extra equity here to 5-3, a lot to 4-3, and then 3s and 4s do a bit better here than they would without deuce being present. So overall, it's a really nice texture for big blind, and one on which big blind can actually probe really frequently. This is a bit of an anomaly because usually big blind is a bit handcuffed in spots like this and has to check again at super high frequency to the razor, who has a protected, in theory, check back range on this flop. But the thing is, with King 3 of hearts, we want to do a ton of betting. This is a hand in the Carrot Poker School I describe as frail. In Grade 2 Lecture 5, the Carrot Poker School is out and ready for purchase at carrotcorner.com. If you happen to be watching this from July 2022 onwards, head on over there. The link is in the description. So we go for this small bet because I'm building a block bet and also an overbet here. The overbet is going to cater to hands like 3-4 sets, 2 pair, good 9x, etc. And the block is going to cater to more hands like 6-4, 5-4, or whatever. That means that when I have a combo like this that could overbet as a bluff or block, I think either is fine. I just roll the RNG and I mix it. This time I rolled a high number, which indicates passivity, but because this is a frail hand, I think I definitely want to bet. What I mean by that is if I check a hand like King 3 of hearts here, it's incredibly hard to continue to a bet effectively, and so this hand actually just gains a bet by pairing its equity with some fold equity and doing the betting. If the hand was a bit better and I was actually happy to check raise here, then I wouldn't mind checking and going for that check raise, but I think hands that want to check raise on this node are going to be stronger draws. Maybe something like 3-4 or another sort of higher straight draw with 2 pair draws that are over cards to the 9 or something like that, or over cards to the 6 at least. I think this hand is probably a little too weak to check raise, though it wouldn't shock me if it was okay, but I think it should just always be betting. Villain folds, so not much to say about this one. 6-9 of spades now in the big blind, and a weaker player. This is a very polarized pool. Weaker player opens on the cutoff, so as you can see there's some orange tags that are people I think are strong regs, and then there are also some blue tags who are people I deem to be recreational. I check the flop of 10-6-5, just opting to check call this hand probably, and this is a really cool exploitative spot on the turn. What I would normally do here against a good player is mix again with block and check, like you saw me doing previously, but there would be a hell of a lot of check. Against this guy there is actually no check. I'm just mainly going to be block betting, and that's because I really don't fear any downside to making this bet. I think it's a well-known fact that recreational players are very bad at checking hands like top pair on the flop and tend to not protect their checking range adequately. Meanwhile, they're going to load it up with way too many hands like ace king, ace queen, etc. So I just opt for a thin value bet here. Without the 9, I think check is more reasonable again. With the 9, I'm just getting a bit greedy and I'm just bleeding small and going for that thin value. I guess you could check here if you thought your opponent was aggressive, but I just think on the 7 turn after checking back flop, the recreational side of the pool is not going to have that much aggression here with their delayed c-bet strategy. So I opt for the small bet, which mainly achieves thin value and denial. On a fairly brickish river for my range, this would be quite thin against a player with a properly protected range, but I think given this guy just has a lot of worse hands than mine, like low pairs, something like ace king, ace queen, I'm just going to block tiny again and see what happens. I don't think check is a bad idea on the river. This hand is getting super thin, but I think the read that people are underprotected here allows me to go thinner for value, and we can almost ignore this 4 straight. There's not going to be a ton of 4x in our opponent's range, but there will be some, and so this is definitely verging on thin. Cutoff versus button, you can mix some 3-bet with king jack here. I think it's fine. I'm going to ignore this 10 BB stack. I'm not too worried about that. If they pick up something and jam, I'll just call it off and see what happens. That's what happens this time. Obviously can't be getting away from this, despite the fact we would rather have all kinds of hands other than this one. I think it's even possible that such a player will just shove 2 random cards here, being on tilt or whatever, from just losing a pot. Unfortunately, we don't get there despite the promise of the queen on the turn, and we lose that one. Guys, IO vs Population is an educational strategic e-magazine on no limit hold'em cash games that you can grab over at carrotcorner.com. It breaks down the theory behind some of the most common and important spots for your win rate, making solver outputs understandable and digestible, so that you can see why the solver is playing the hands the way it chooses to do so. With PIO vs Population, you never have to feel lost like you're staring at a meaningless sea of hand charts, because we'll break down the logic behind every strategy we recommend. But not only that, the most lucrative thing about PIO vs Population is that for every spot we cover, we show you how your opponents are likely to go wrong. This means you can craft a really effective exploitative strategy and punish them to devastating effect. You can learn how to master a key spot, not just theoretically, but exploitatively too, for just $9.99 an episode. Or why not pick up our mega bundle and save £50 in the process? You never need to feel lost again in those tricky common spots with PIO vs Population, e-magazine for no limit hold'em cash games, available only at carrotcorner.com. Now let's get back to the action. This is a really cool spot. I really like this hand. It's so instructive and there's so much to actually point out here, so let's get into it. We have queen 9 off in the big blind. Very marginal call, but against min raise with an expected skill edge against the weaker player, I go ahead and peel. I think it's really important to just forget charts in these instances and deviate towards playing more hands when you think you have a skill edge, especially when you're over 100 big blinds deep. Villain goes for half pot here and we have a really easy check raise. The problem with just calling against half pot is that such a merged looking bet is very often just going to cater to a range that wants to check back the turn. So I think just understanding that when you face a bet out of position, your urgency to build the pot is quite high to avoid just landing on the river after calling here and therefore just making a raise. We get the 10 of hearts, which is not the best turn, jack 8 and king jack, both now getting there. There are quite a lot of straights in villain's range if you imagine that they have 20 combos in total, 4 jack 8 suited and 16 king jack offsuit and suited we unblock. None of them. We go for half pot here. I think the sizing is fine. We could probably go a bit bigger as well, but we're just trying to accommodate for the fact that I might want to just bet fold on this node and that my hand is turned into a little bit of a tier 2 rather than tier 1 value grabber at this point. We still also lose to the rare sets of queens and 9s and the slightly more common set of 7s, as well as the set of 10s, as well as queen 10. So our hand has definitely been demoted here, and I think it's important not to get too carried away with this holding at this point. If we face a jam here, I wouldn't be that optimistic. This has looked like a fairly passive recreational player. If they had the pink tag, which indicates aggression, it'd be a little bit harder to bet fold this turn, but I think bet fold is probably the plan. That said, villain doesn't actually have to fast play any hand here and can definitely slow play straights, though sometimes they will just not be able to resist raising. And on the 4 of clubs river, I think we have another easy value bet. Again, we just want to watch our sizing here, not overbet, not go for all of the money, but go for something like B75. This is again a good way to play a hand like this that I estimate has around 80% equity at this point. Something like that. I feel slightly more optimistic when villain doesn't jam the turn on such a connected texture, because oftentimes even passive players are going to feel like they have to do that when they have a straight or set. Therefore, I'm pretty confident that my equity is over 80% there and thus qualifying for the sizing of large bet. Try to remember that that is the rough equity requirement for such a play. What you don't want to be doing is saying just because I have the best hand really often, I want to like shove all in, because you won't have the best hand incredibly often after that gets called. There's just so many combos of straights here, like I say, that are just able to snap you off. And straights are just a very abundant hand. They're annoying and they're easier to have than flushes, therefore they're lower down in the hand rankings grid than flushes, because they're so easy to have. When you open 16 combos of king jack it just becomes a ton of your range after you bet call a flop like this. Some players will fold the gutter on the flop, but not too many. I think it's a fairly easy call, especially being a gutter to the nuts. So villain has a think here. Obviously we're hoping for a call, but instead we get the jam. And just look at how quickly I fold here. I'm not even interested in paying this bet off, because if someone is sick enough to bluff here when I can still have all the combos of straights as well, then good for them. I think the amount of the time I'm getting bluffed there is sub 10%. Maybe even sub 5%, and I think calling would be a gigantic error that we always want to avoid. Never get sucked in by the absolute hand strength of your hand. When we face such a raise, you have to squarely put your opponent's range mainly around these 20 combos of straights, especially when your opponent is a passive player and when the line is just so rare and bizarre and unappealing to bluff with. Put yourself in villain's shoes. How would you feel about jamming over this big river bet with some kind of hand like Queen Jack here? Because that's what you'd have to do. You'd have to be turning pairs like this into bluffs at a reasonable frequency in order to even get close to balancing out all of those straights in your range that want to jam. So very easy fold, and I'm quite confident we'll be shown King Jack if we call. This next hand is a really important lesson in what happens to hand strength as a texture runs out in quite an extreme way. I think this is a really illustrative one, guys, so definitely pay attention. 10-8-4 and we go for a check. Villain decides to c-bet the flop large, and we have a very easy check call. I'd be building a more polarized raising range than this against a big bet. Against a small bet, we could consider raising for thin value and denial with this combo. We do decide to call. The Jack of Spades comes on the turn. Horrible for our hand, but good for our range. Not the sort of turn our opponent will be blasting an absolute ton on because it's so connected with the 8 and the 10. Generally speaking, nugget of wisdom here, any turn that is connected to stuff that called a big bet is going to be a really bad one for the preflop raiser. So here, the stuff that calls a big bet is very centered around having hit the flop. Our range is not hanging about against a big bet with pocket threes or ace-6 of clubs. We're hanging around with stuff that is related to the 10, to the 8, to the straight potential, to the flush potential of this board. Therefore, on the Jack, it's quite hard for us to be folding at a high frequency, and actually a lot of hands in Villain's range are going to be absolutely degraded, and therefore they'll want to just check back a lot more. The Jack is going to merge their range because it's going to make hands like kings, aces, etc. more mediocre, and of course our opponent is the one that holds a monopoly on those now mediocre combos. So they'll check back a lot. We head over to the Queen of Spades river, and now it's time to ask ourselves, where are we in our range? We do need to be betting the bottom of our range here as a bluff. We do have some missed diamond draws, stuff like ace-x of diamonds, king-x of diamonds, that I would use before I would use ace-8, but I also think that some pairs on this node are probably going to get bluffed. If we had a hand like pocket 7s or 6s with a diamond that called flop, I think bluffing is reasonable. With a hand like 4-5 or ace-4, I think bluffing is definitely good. I think ace-8 is slightly too far up, and the other problem here is that the Queen of Spades is a redeeming river for Villain's range. While it brings a 4 straight and they're not going to have a ton of 9x here, they are going to have ace-king a huge amount of the time, and they're also going to pair this river a lot. Therefore, I think that even though our range was super happy on the turn, it's less happy on the river and probably just wants to do a lot of block betting and checking. This is a node that if you put it into the solver, I'm fairly confident, and I haven't done this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly confident that the solver will only use block on this river. And I think the reason it will do that is just that ace-king is prevalent and it's quite common in cutoff's range, and I'm not sure that you need to be going big when Villain is supposed to be raising you pretty frequently for value or as a bluff if you go smaller. So the more often you get raised if you go small, the less you need to actually use a large bet, theoretically speaking. We talk about all of this in the Carrot Poker School, which is available from July 2022 on carrotcorner.com. Check it out, get yourself that highly slick professional video course. So with ace-8, we do reluctantly check here. We're going to have really low pot share, and Villain should just be bluffing with many of the hands that we beat. That said, I think the Queen of Spades is too destructive a river, and we're slightly too far up our range to be bluffing. Villain checks down the King, Queen of Diamonds, and we lose that one. Ace-4 suited is one of these hands that you want to mix a 4-bet into your strategy in this configuration, and we decide to do that. It would help if I actually played the video. I'm sitting here just like, how we seem to be taking our time about this. I think we're gonna 4-bet this one if I recall correctly. You don't have to do this every time, but I think ace-4 and ace-5 are going to be some of the more common ones that we opt to 4-bet bluff. Go for 20, bit bigger out of position because we are going to incur some flats here from our opponent, so just adding to the price is going to be fine. King 4-6, fantastic board for range. Villain is not 3-betting 6s and 4s at high frequency here, nor does he have much king-x prevalence compared to us. So this is a range bet. We're obviously not trying to go all in there. That was a misclick. That would be a little bit overzealous. So we go for quarter pot, which is totally standard in these situations. I think building a checking range on this board at all would just be a mistake. The king is by far the best Broadway here with a 4-better, and it's also very cool that there's only 0 set-making cards. Only 0, guys. Set-making cards in the buttons range, so that's nice. It'd be much worse if it was Queen 8-7, 2 set-making cards in a worse Broadway, right? Really different textures, just worth comparing those. On the 4 turn, we are ecstatic and we can mix between check and small bet. Going for a large bet here is utterly ludicrous, and the reason it's totally silly is that you're making nothing in your opponent's range indifferent with that extra money. Like if villain has a hand here like 8s or 9s or jacks or 10s, a hand that would be indifferent, you only need to bet small to make that hand 0 EV. Now the hand can fold or it can call, so your range doesn't need to invest any more than that to make that hand 0 EV, and you can't make that hand worse than 0 EV, because villain just folds in theory the minute it becomes negative. So if you jam and then 10s becomes a minus EV call, villain just folds it, and you're just overpaying against the rest of villain's range. So if you run into like the rare pocket 6s or ace king here, when you have a hand like king queen, or when you're bluffing, like why do you need to jam? What are you actually achieving? It's overpaying for what your range is trying to achieve. Therefore, using a big bet here is immediately an EV loss. One thing beginners and newer players may fall victim to is the thought process of, oh, there's only a pot size bet left, so therefore I have to just jam it. That's kind of like a fallacy. And the fallacy is trying to be too neat and tidy with lining up sizes to the pot. That's actually really arbitrary, and it's much more about what your opponent's range shape is and how polarized it is and what hands you can make indifferent for what sizing with your own range than it is about actually trying to just line up the bet size with the pot. This is a really common leak I see in newer players. So we decide to bet 1/3 pot here, which is the sizing our range uses. Our opponent folds. What can you do? We're obviously getting paid there by any kind of king X combos that we unblock. We do block some ace king with that hand, so maybe we want to check sometimes, but we also block some bluffs which are ace high too, so I'm not sure it's clear. Okay, interesting session, guys, and I will see you on the next one where we're going to do more battling against tough regs. I've got another table I didn't show on screen here to show you next week, so that'll be coming out next Friday. Do check it out, and I'll see you soon. Good luck at the tables, and check out carrotcorner.com for everything from me. Bye for now.